The calculus professor singled out the quiet woman's son, voice sharp, smile amused, clearly enjoying the moment. He tossed a problem onto the board, the kind meant to break confidence, not teach. Snickers rippled through the room. The boy froze. The professor leaned back, satisfied. That's when the woman stood, calm, unrushed, no anger in her face. What no one there knew was this: she wasn't just his mother. She was a calculus mind the professor had no defense against. The lecture hall was already tense before anything happened. Advanced calculus. Third week. The kind of class where students sat stiff, pens ready, afraid to blink. The professor liked it that way. Silence meant control. He paced slowly in front of the board, shoes tapping with purpose, eyes scanning rows like he was searching for weakness. Then his gaze stopped. Back row. Near the aisle. A teenage boy sat there, shoulders slightly hunched, notebook perfectly aligned, eyes down. Quiet. Too quiet. The kind professors noticed when they wanted an example. You, the professor said, voice sharp. The boy flinched and looked up. Yes, you. Stand up. Chairs creaked. A few students glanced back. Some already knew where this was going. The professor adjusted his glasses. You've been very quiet this semester. The boy swallowed. I try to listen, sir. A faint chuckle moved through the room. The professor smiled, not warmly. Listening is not the same as understanding, he said. Since you're so attentive, you won't mind solving this. He turned and wrote a long, brutal expression across the board. Nested integrals. A substitution trap. The kind of problem designed to expose, not educate. A murmur spread. Someone whispered, "That's unfair." Someone else whispered, "He's done." The professor stepped aside. Go on. Walk us through it. The boy stood frozen. He stared at the board. His hands trembled. He knew parts of it. He knew enough to know it was a setup. His voice cracked. I haven't seen it done that way yet. The professor tilted his head. Interesting, because everyone else has. A lie, and everyone knew it. The boy's ears burned. He felt eyes on his back. He felt small. He felt 12 years old again instead of 16. I suppose, the professor continued, not everyone here belongs in advanced calculus. That did it. A few snickers escaped. One student winced. Another looked away. In the second row, a woman sat perfectly still. She hadn't planned to draw attention. She had chosen that seat for a reason. Close enough to hear, far enough to disappear. Plain sweater. Hair tied back. No makeup worth noticing. Just another parent attending a special open enrollment program with her son. She had watched quietly, listened quietly, calculated quietly. Now she watched her son's jaw tighten. Take your time, the professor said, clearly enjoying himself. Or would you prefer to sit down? The boy hesitated. He shook his head. I'll try. He stepped toward the board. Chalk squeaked. His first line was correct. The second wasn't wrong, but it wasn't the trap-proof path. The professor pounced instantly. No, stop. That substitution collapses the domain. You didn't even check the bounds. The boy froze again. Sit, the professor snapped. We don't have time for guesswork. The word guesswork lingered like poison. The boy returned to his seat, face red, eyes glassy. He stared at his notebook like it might save him. The professor turned back to the class. Let this be a lesson. Silence does not equal competence. That's when the chair moved. It was quiet, but it moved. The woman stood. Not fast, not angry, just up. The room noticed immediately. Parents weren't supposed to interrupt. Everyone knew that rule. Yes, the professor said, irritated. Can I help you? She met his eyes. Calm, steady. You just embarrassed my son, she said. A hush fell. Phones stopped moving. Pens paused. The professor scoffed. This is a university-level class. If your son can't keep up, he can, she said softly. That softness unsettled him more than shouting would have. And, she continued, your criticism of his method was incomplete. A few students inhaled sharply. The professor laughed once. Excuse me, you're right that his substitution wasn't optimal, she said, but it didn't collapse the domain. You stopped him before the corrective transformation. Silence. Heavy now. The professor's smile stiffened. And you know this because? She looked at the board. Really looked. Because the integral can be reduced by reframing the inner function before substitution, she said, which avoids the bounds issue entirely. Someone whispered, Is she serious? The professor folded his arms. Ma'am, this is advanced calculus, not a parent-teacher conference. She nodded. I know. Then she took a step toward the board. If you'd allow, she said, I can show the class. A beat, 2, 3. The professor stared at her, weighing pride against curiosity. Against the eyes watching him now, he smiled again. Then, dangerous. By all means, he said. Enlighten us. She reached for the chalk, and the room leaned forward without realizing why. The chalk felt natural in her hand. Not heavy, not symbolic, just familiar. She didn't rush. She didn't speak right away. She stood facing the board, eyes tracing the equation the professor had written with such deliberate cruelty. It was layered to intimidate, structured to trap, a problem meant to expose weakness, not teach understanding. First, she said calmly, we need to admit what this problem is pretending to be. A few students shifted. That wasn't how answers usually started. It looks like a standard substitution problem, she continued, lifting the chalk. That's intentional. She underlined one section, then another. But that's not where the work actually begins. The professor crossed his arms. She rewrote the inner function cleanly, separating it from the surrounding terms. The board began to change. The equation lost its threat. The mistake most people make, she said evenly, is treating this inner relationship as fixed. She paused just long enough for the words to land. It isn't. A student in the front row leaned forward. Another stopped typing. You don't substitute yet, she said. You reframe. Chalk moved again. Slow, precise, each line purposeful. She re-expressed one variable in terms of another, then simplified before the substitution ever happened. A quiet murmur spread. The professor stepped closer. You're assuming continuity, he said sharply, without justification. She nodded without turning. Only if you ignore the constraint already built into the denominator. She tapped it once. Lightly. Silence followed. She continued. This constraint forces continuity across the interval. She rewrote the bounds, not fully yet, just enough to hint at where it was going. The problem was shrinking. In the back row, her son stared at the board. His confusion was gone now, replaced by recognition. This was where he had been stopped earlier. She pointed to that exact line. This is where you interrupted him, she said, not accusing, just stating. The professor stiffened. If he'd been allowed to continue, she added, he would have corrected the bounds here. She made the correction. Clean, undeniable, and the domain holds. No one laughed now. No one whispered. The professor stared at the board, realizing something he hadn't planned for. The problem was no longer his. She didn't pause for permission. She didn't look back. She simply kept writing. With the bounds corrected, she said, the substitution becomes obvious. She completed it in 2 steps. Not rushed, not embellished, just efficient. The board looked different now. Lighter. What had once seemed cruel and overwhelming was becoming reasonable. A student near the aisle whispered, that's cleaner. Another whispered back, why didn't he show us that? The professor heard them. His jaw tightened. You're skipping steps, he said, louder than necessary. She turned slightly. I removed steps that were no longer required. She gestured at the board. Every transformation is still there. Nothing is hidden. She finished the integral, circled the result. Same answer, she said. Fewer operations. The room stayed silent. Not confused silence. Thinking silence. The professor stared at the solution. He leaned in. He scanned for errors, for shortcuts disguised as elegance. He found none. That approach, he said slowly, is unconventional. She nodded. Most useful ones are. A ripple moved through the room. Not laughter this time. Something closer to relief. He straightened. Where did you learn this? She erased a small redundant term and rewrote it more cleanly. I didn't learn it, she said. I refined it. The professor's eyes narrowed. Refined it from where? She turned fully now. Calm. Grounded. From years of solving problems that didn't come with answer keys, she replied. The weight of that answer settled differently. He looked around, and that's when he realized it. No one was watching him anymore. Every face was turned toward the board, toward clarity, toward her. You're out of line, he said, but the words lacked force. She didn't raise her voice. You embarrassed a student for not finishing a thought you didn't let him complete. Her son sat straighter now, not smiling, just breathing again. The professor hesitated. Pride wrestled with evidence. "This is not how I teach," he said. She met his gaze. "Then today, your students learned something new." Another pause. Longer this time. He exhaled sharply. "Finish it." Not a challenge anymore. A concession. She turned back to the board and added the final clarification. One sentence. One arrow. "There," she said. "Now it's teachable." She set the chalk down. And for the first time that morning, the professor had no words ready. The room didn't move when she stepped away from the board. No scraping chairs. No coughing. No whispers. It was the kind of silence that only appears when something irreversible has happened. The professor stood frozen for a moment longer than he meant to. He had expected defiance, even arrogance. What he hadn't expected was precision, calm, control without apology. He cleared his throat. "That will be all," he said, trying to reclaim the rhythm of authority. No one moved. He glanced around. Students were still staring at the board, at the solution, at the absence of confusion they had felt for the first time in weeks. "You may sit," he added, sharper now. She returned to her seat without a word. No triumph, no glance backward. She folded her hands and looked forward like she belonged there, because she did. The professor erased the board too quickly. Chalk dust rose in a pale cloud, smearing what had just been proven. A few students flinched. One sighed quietly. "We'll continue," he said, voice tight, but the lecture never recovered. Every example he gave after that felt heavier, slower, less certain. He caught himself explaining steps he'd never explained before, checking bounds aloud, justifying transitions. And every time he did, he felt it. Comparison. Halfway through the class, he stopped. "You," he said suddenly, pointing. Not at the back row this time, but at the woman. The boy beside her stiffened instantly. "Yes," she replied calmly. "What is your background?" he asked. The room leaned in. This wasn't procedural. This wasn't academic housekeeping. This was curiosity breaking through pride. She took a breath. "Mathematics," she said. A few students exchanged looks. "Formally?" the professor pressed. She shook her head. "Not in the way you mean." "So you admit," he said, seizing the opening, "that you're not trained at this level." She met his gaze. "I admit that I wasn't allowed to be." That answer landed differently. The professor frowned. "Explain." "I studied math on my own," she said, "for years. At night, between jobs, between responsibilities." A student near the front swallowed hard. "I solved problems because they made sense," she continued, "not because someone graded them." The professor folded his arms. "That doesn't replace credentials." "No," she agreed, "but it does replace fear." A low murmur rippled through the room. "You're saying," he said slowly, "that my student understood the material." She nodded. "He was thinking ahead of where you stopped him." The boy's face flushed, not with shame now, but with something unfamiliar. Validation. The professor looked at him, really looked this time. "You recognize the structure?" he asked the boy. The boy hesitated, then nodded. "I just hadn't finished." The professor exhaled through his nose. "Sit," he said, softer than before. The boy didn't flinch this time. The professor turned back to the woman. "You're auditing this class?" "Yes." "Why?" She didn't answer immediately. She glanced at her son, then back at the professor. "Because he loves math," she said. "And because I wanted to make sure he didn't learn to be afraid of it." That did something to the room. The professor nodded once. "You realize," he said, "that what you demonstrated aligns with research-level thinking." She shrugged slightly. "Math doesn't care where you learn it." A student raised a hand, hesitant. "Yes," the professor said automatically. Are we allowed to think like that?" the student asked. The question hung there, simple, dangerous. The professor opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at the erased board, at the empty space where clarity had been. Then he said something no one expected. "Yes," he said. The word echoed louder than any lecture had that day. He turned to the woman again. "Stay," he said. Not a request, not a command, something in between. She nodded once. Class ended 10 minutes later. No one rushed out. Students lingered, whispered, looked between the professor and the woman like they were watching gravity shift. As the room finally emptied, the professor remained behind. So, he said quietly, when only the three of them were left. Yes, she replied. He hesitated. Pride fought one last time. Would you, he said carefully, be willing to show me how you arrived at that reframing? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled, just slightly. That, she said, depends on how willing you are to listen. The hallway outside the lecture hall buzzed with low voices. Students clustered in uneven knots, replaying what they had just witnessed in fragments and whispers. No one laughed. No one joked. The energy wasn't excitement, it was recalibration. Something they trusted had shifted, and they were trying to understand where they now stood. Inside the room, the professor closed the door. The click sounded louder than it should have. He leaned against the desk instead of standing behind it. That choice alone said more than words. You didn't have to do that, he said. She remained seated, calm, grounded. Neither did you. He rubbed his temple. You undermined my authority. She tilted her head slightly. No, your authority was never the issue. He frowned. Then what was? She answered without hesitation. Fear. The word sat between them. He straightened. You think I teach through fear? I think you confuse rigor with intimidation, she said. And you're not alone. He let out a short, humorless laugh. You're very comfortable criticizing someone whose class you don't even belong in. She met his eyes. I belong anywhere math is treated honestly. That stopped him. He walked to the board and stared at the empty space where her solution had been erased. His reflection stared back, distorted by chalk dust and light. You know, he said quietly, students don't challenge me. She nodded. They shouldn't have to. That's how standards slip, he replied. No, she said. That's how standards survive. He turned. You really believe that? I've lived it, she replied. He studied her now, not as an interruption, not as a problem, but as a variable he hadn't accounted for. You said you studied alone, he said. For years. Yes. Why? She exhaled slowly. Because I was told I wasn't built for it. Too quiet, too slow, too distracted. He said nothing. So I learned without permission, she continued. I learned because no one was grading me. No one was watching for mistakes. I learned because curiosity is patient. That word again. Patient. He looked down. And your son. She glanced at him through the glass window in the door. He was laughing softly with another student now. Lighter. He thinks like that too, she said. But he's learning to be afraid. The professor closed his eyes briefly. That wasn't my intention, he said. Intent doesn't erase impact, she replied gently. A long silence followed. Not hostile. Reflective. I built this class to separate the serious from the unprepared, he said. And instead, she said, you separated confidence from understanding. He sighed. You're asking me to change how I've taught for 20 years. I'm asking you to notice who disappears in those 20 years, she replied. He looked back at the board. You reframed the problem instinctively. Yes, that's not standard training, he said. No, she agreed. It's pattern recognition without ego. That stung. He didn't deny it. You know what happens, he said slowly. When students see authority corrected, they learn it's human, she said. They test it, he countered. They trust it, she replied. He laughed quietly, shaking his head. You make it sound simple. It is, she said. It's just not easy. Another pause. You said earlier, he began, that your answer depended on whether I was willing to listen. She nodded. He pulled a chair out and sat, not behind the desk, across from her. Show me, he said. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She opened her notebook. The pages were worn, annotated, dense with margins full of alternatives, cross-references, questions written and answered in different inks. This, she said, pointing, is where most textbooks stop. And this, she continued, flipping a page, is where curiosity starts. They talked for nearly an hour, not arguing, not defending, testing ideas, following threads, breaking them, rebuilding them cleaner. At some point, the professor realized he wasn't leading the conversation anymore. He was participating in it. That reframing, he said slowly, could actually reduce cognitive load for first-time learners. She nodded. Which is why your best students leave, and your quiet ones stay silent. He leaned back. You should be teaching. She shook her head. I am, just not officially. That's a waste, he said. Only if titles matter more than outcomes, she replied. He looked at the clock, surprised at how much time had passed. You know, he said, this department prides itself on excellence. Then it should be proud of students who think differently, she said. He nodded slowly. Would you consider, he began carefully, working with me? She looked at him, really looked. On one condition, she said. Name it. You stop calling curiosity a weakness, she replied. He didn't answer immediately. Then he stood, extended his hand. Deal, he said. She shook it. Outside, students waited, watching through the glass. When the door opened and they stepped out together, the hallway went quiet. The professor spoke first. Class, he said, will be different starting tomorrow. A beat. And better, he added. Her son looked up at her then. Eyes searching. She nodded once. And for the first time since walking into that building, she knew something had truly changed. The next morning felt different before anyone spoke. Students entered the lecture hall slower than usual, eyes scanning the room as if expecting proof that yesterday had really happened. The board was clean. The desks were the same, but something invisible had shifted. The professor arrived early. No dramatic entrance. No sweeping glance meant to intimidate. He placed his notes on the desk, paused, then erased them. All of them. When the room filled, he didn't start with warnings. Before we begin, he said, voice steady but quieter than usual, I owe you clarity. That word, clarity, rippled through the room. I've taught this course as a filter, he continued, and filters remove more than impurities. They remove voices. A few students exchanged stunned looks. That changes today. In the third row, the woman sat beside her son. He watched the professor carefully, unsure whether to trust what he was hearing. We will still work hard, the professor said, but we will not confuse difficulty with humiliation. He turned to the board and wrote a problem. Not brutal, honest. Let's solve this together. No one laughed. No one froze. Hands began to rise, tentative at first, then stronger. The professor listened, actually listened. He let students finish their thoughts. He asked why instead of pointing out where they were wrong. And when someone made a mistake, he didn't pounce. He paused. Let's see where that leads, he said. The woman didn't speak that day. She didn't need to. She watched the room breathe again. Her son raised his hand once. Yes, the professor said. I think there's another way to reduce it, the boy said carefully. The professor nodded. Show us. The boy stood, not shaking this time. He walked to the board and wrote. He paused, corrected himself, continued. When he finished, the professor smiled. Not thin, not forced. Good, he said. Very good. The room responded not with laughter, but with something better, respect. Over the next weeks, the class changed in ways no syllabus could predict. Students stayed after. They argued not defensively but curiously. They asked questions without apologizing for them. The professor adapted faster than anyone expected. He rewrote examples, invited alternative approaches. Sometimes he even said the words he'd avoided for decades. I don't know. Let's find out. Those words spread faster than any formula. One afternoon, the woman was stopped in the hallway by a student she didn't recognize. Are you the one from the first day? The student asked quietly. She nodded. Thank you, the student said. I almost dropped the class. The woman smiled gently. I almost did once too. The department noticed. Of course they did. Attendance rose. Grades stabilized. Evaluations shifted in tone. And one email arrived that changed things again. The professor called her that evening. They want me to present, he said, on instructional reform. She waited. I told them I wouldn't, he continued, unless you stood with me. A pause. I'm not faculty, she said. You're a mathematician, he replied. She exhaled slowly. I don't want a spotlight. I know, he said. That's why it matters. The presentation was packed. Faculty, students, administrators who rarely attended anything without obligation. The professor spoke first. About rigor, about mistakes, about the cost of confusing intimidation with excellence. Then he stepped aside. She didn't introduce herself with titles. She spoke about curiosity, about silence, about how many brilliant minds learn to hide because no one taught them how to speak safely. The room listened. Questions followed. Real ones, respectful ones. When it ended, Applause filled the hall, not loud, but long. Afterward, her son tugged her sleeve. "Mom," he said quietly, "are you famous now?" She laughed softly. "No." "Good," he said. "I just wanted them to hear you." That summer, the department revised its curriculum. Slowly, carefully, not perfectly, but intentionally. The professor invited her to co-design problem sets. She agreed without her name attached. She preferred it that way. On the last day of class, the professor addressed the students one final time. "Mathematics," he said, "is not a weapon. It's a language." He looked at the back row, at the boy, "and everyone here deserves fluency." As students filed out, the woman lingered. "You changed this place," the professor said quietly. She shook her head. "I reminded it what it already was." He nodded. "Will you come back next term?" She glanced at her son. He was laughing with classmates now, confident, unafraid. "Yes," she said, "but not to sit quietly." He smiled. Neither of them needed fear anymore.